already just said, Tom Woods is one of my heroes. In the last couple of years, I've been working on getting a degree or a graduate degree in economics with a focus on Austrian economics, and by far he's up there right now with people like Bob Murphy and Tom DiLorenzo or Peter Schiff or people like that. So kudos for you for getting Dr. Woods. That's a tremendous accomplishment. From Beaufort, 4 hours from here, down the coast. Beautiful in a different way. That the upstate is beautiful. I know the upstate too. I went to Furman, which is where I met Mark Sanford. He was one of my good friends at Furman, and he ultimately is the guy that got me involved in politics 10 years ago when he left Congress, and he term limited himself. We're talking about term limits. After 3 terms, he got out, and then he decided he wanted to run for governor. And so in 2002, he called me and said, you know, Tom, I want to run for governor. Can you come help me? And I like politics. I'd never been involved in that before, but I talked to my law partners because I'm a lawyer in Beaufort. I talked to my wife, talked to my children, and they said, okay, go for it. Little did they know what that was going to lead to. But I took a 6-month leave of absence, moved into his basement in Charleston. Long story short, he ended up winning the primary, winning the gubernatorial election, and I went back to my law practice. And it absolutely killed me to see him go to Columbia and then start to work on some of these things that we talked about during the campaign. And I was back, you know, setting up corporations and closing real estate deals, and it wasn't as fulfilling as it had been before. And so I took another leave of absence after talking to my wife and my children and my partners, and became his chief of staff and worked for several years in Columbia as chief of staff. And left in 2008 and ran for the state senate against an incumbent and beat the incumbent in the primary, and then beat the Democratic opponent in the general election, and I've been in the state senate for a year. And talk about term limits, I've term limited myself. I'm going to spend 2 terms in the state senate. I've got no desire to climb the ladder there, Harry, and one day be a dictator, committee chairman, excuse me, in charge of things. But while I'm up there, I want to make a difference. And what I want to talk to you guys about is the difference I think that I can help make and what needs to be made in Columbia. But before I talk about South Carolina and talk about the things that I think are necessary there, I've started to talk a little bit about the federal government and the predicament it's in as a backdrop to what I think needs to be done at the state level. I don't want to sound overly pessimistic, but I pretty much lost faith in Republicans and Democrats in Washington, D.C. to do anything material to address our problems. We have a $16 trillion debt. I can't even fathom $16 trillion. We've had over 3 years in a row now of $1 trillion plus budget deficits. We haven't even had a budget in over 3 years. We've seen no effort made at all to control entitlements. I see no appetite for that whatsoever. And what's really scared me as I've delved into my economic studies is learning about the Federal Reserve and learning what it's doing to enable, and it is an enabler, what it does to enable the federal government to live profitably, what it does to allow them to incur this debt, to maintain this entitlement structure. Because every year they've got to come up with $1 trillion+ simply to match the outlays that they've appropriated. And so if you look at how that happens, the Treasury goes out and they sell securities. Those securities are purchased by what are called primary dealers, whether Goldman Sachs or J.P. Morgan. And then in turn, those primary dealers sell those securities to the Federal Reserve, which prints money to buy those securities. And so you kind of follow it all the way back, and the way that we're paying our national debt and the way we're propping up entitlement spending is by the Federal Reserve printing more money and putting it into our economy, to the point where over the last 3 years, we have tripled our monetary base. We have tripled our monetary base. I mean, that just absolutely astounds me. The number of these in the economy now has been tripled in the last 3 years. And you ask yourself, well, why haven't we seen inflation yet? And why haven't we seen prices skyrocket? Well, in some respects we have. But one of the main reasons is that while Ben Bernanke is telling the Fed to go ahead and buy these Treasury securities to finance an unsustainable budget, he's paying banks interest on their excess reserves so they don't lend them out. So all they're doing is piling up. And so at some point in time, I mean, there's no exit strategy here because those dollars aren't being sucked back out of the economy. They're earning interest, okay, and they're just getting worse and worse and worse. And historically, the Fed would inject money into the economy by buying Treasury securities. And Treasury securities are fairly marketable, and you could sell them back out to the public, and the money that's paid into the Fed, they could then destroy it and then go ahead and bring the monetary base back. They can't do that now because of what they've done the last 3 years. I mean, Ben Bernanke has taken the Federal Reserve and given it powers, or just taken power, that no other Fed chairman would have even assumed. I mean, he's buying not just Treasury securities, he's buying toxic assets from specific banks. I mean, he's allowing certain companies to fail, like Lehman Brothers, because they haven't curried favor, and other companies like Bear Stearns he's saving because they have curried favor. I mean, we absolutely, and I got into a little bit of trouble in Tampa in calling Ben Bernanke a monetary dictator, but that's what he is. I mean, he sits there and he creates money and buys toxic assets from his corporate friends, and it dilutes the savings of everybody else. And it runs counter to everything we've learned about government in America. I mean, our Constitution was founded on the premise that man is flawed, man is corrupt. I mean, the old adage that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. I mean, those are true things, and they're as true today as they were back in 1789 when the federal Constitution was ratified. And so what our founders did, quite wisely, is they went ahead and they took government power and they split it up into separate branches and had those branches check and balance each other so that too much power was never reposed in one person or one branch of government. Because they were afraid of tyranny. They had just gotten a heavy dose of tyranny from King George, and they didn't want that in America. But flash forward today, and the most powerful man in America, and I would say the most powerful man in the world right now, is Ben Bernanke, the chairman of the Federal Reserve. He has the ability, at a whim, to fire up the printing press and shove money into the economy and buy up toxic assets that could never be resold. I mean, he's not going to be able to suck that money back out. Who's going to buy these toxic assets? No one is. That money's out there, and it's diluted our savings. So those three things have really made me pessimistic about federal government. The $16 trillion debt and the $1 trillion a year deficits, the explosion in entitlements with no appetite whatsoever to curb them, and the way all this is being financed in a way by the Federal Reserve, which isn't accountable to any of you, by the way. They do whatever they want. It's unchecked power. So I am extremely pessimistic about our federal government. And I hope Mitt Romney, if I have to choose between Mitt Romney and Barack Obama, okay, Mitt Romney is better. Because I think Barack Obama has his own path to ruin. Now, I didn't endorse Mitt Romney in the primary. I'll just be honest with you. I didn't think he was the guy that was talking about our problems with the precision and the passion and the knowledge that Ron Paul was. And so I went out there and endorsed Ron Paul because I believe, and I realize that his speaking style isn't very smooth, and I realize that his way of presenting ideas isn't always, packaged with sound bites. In a lot of ways, he's like John the Baptist. He's kind of wandering around in the wilderness and he's speaking truth, eating locusts and honey and whatever. And over time, enough people follow him and they start to realize he's telling the truth. I think he's telling the truth. So it's important to me that I stand for that during the primary process, and I did. So I hope Obama loses this fall, but even if he loses this fall, I don't think it gets us out of a hole at all, because I don't see Congress getting a backbone. And I still don't see the will to tackle the problems that are facing our country in terms of our debt and our entitlements. So what does that mean? What can I do as a state legislator, seeing this and believing this and thinking it's true? What is my responsibility? Well, my responsibility is, during this period that we have until there's an implosion or a meltdown or whatever you want to call it in Washington, D.C., is to get South Carolina's House in order, to weatherproof us, to make us strong, to make us a state that is able to address the needs of our constituents when that inevitable time comes and the federal government stops sending money down to us to the degree it has in the past. Let me just use one example of what I think will happen. Medicaid. Not Medicare, but Medicaid, which is health insurance for the poor in South Carolina. It's run by the state government. And the way that it's funded is that for every dollar that the state appropriates for Medicaid in the budget each year, the federal government matches it with $3 in return. So it's a 3-to-1 match. And so What did we in South Carolina do when the recession hit and we went from a high of $7 billion in the general fund in 2007 down to a low of $5 billion in 2009? It's a $2 billion, 7 to 5, that's a huge drop in percentage basis. What did we do? Well, we took money out of education and out of roads and out of law enforcement and out of core government services. Man, I'm not an anarchist. I don't believe there's no role for government. There's a role, not much, but and we took the money from those things and we diverted it into Medicaid because we wanted to have that 3-to-1 federal match. And the argument was on the floor that let's take money from schools and from roads and from law enforcement and from SLED and from corrections and from whatever, and let's dump it into Medicaid and expand that Medicaid pool, and by a magic federal alchemy, we'll get $3 in return from Washington, D.C., and we'll be in great shape. Well, do you remember when Mark Sanford refused to take that stimulus money? Yes. He refused to take that $787 million. The reason he did was, and this is back in 2009, not the Affordable Care Act, before that, the very first thing he did, the stimulus, is that the federal government says we have $787 million for you, South Carolina, that you can put in your Medicaid program. And if you don't use it, we're going to give it to some other states. And so the legislators are just salivating. They want this money. And so, they want to appropriate it, but the hitch was, it seemed as if the governor had to make an application for those funds. The way that stimulus package was set up, it was a large chunk of it was at the governor's discretion. And Governor Sanford said, no, I'm not going to take that money. And so you ask yourself, well, why is that? Well, because the strings that were attached to that $707 million was that if you take that money, you can no longer shrink your Medicaid pool. You have to have a Medicaid pool that is at the size that we dictated, and you can never contract it. And that's important because there are 3 cost drivers when it comes to Medicaid, 3 things that drive costs. One is the size of the population, the number of people that are getting the services. The second is the scope of services, the things that being in the program entitles them to get from doctors and hospitals. And the third cost driver is what amount of money is paid to the actual providers of medical services, hospitals and doctors, and what do you pay them? Well, we were about to surrender control over one of those primary cost drivers, because typically you define a Medicaid pool as a percentage of the federal poverty index. And, it was about 150% at one point in time. And I think federal poverty index was like 12 to 13,000, whatever it is. I'm not sure exactly what it is. But as that pool got larger and we couldn't afford it, we would always contract that pool back down. Well, now we have, thanks to taking this money and thanks to surrendering control over that to the federal government, the pool is 200% of federal poverty. We have 1 million people in Medicaid right now. Out of 4.6 million South Carolinians, a little over 1 million people are in Medicaid right now. And Tony Keck at HHS is powerless to contract that down to 175% of poverty or 150% of poverty to control costs because we've given that away. And so you look at what's going to happen over time. The federal government, when that meltdown hits that I've talked about, before it touches Medicare and before it touches Social Security and before it touches any other entitlement, it's going to go after Medicaid and it's going to say to states, we can no longer give you a 3-to-1 match ratio. We'll give you now 2-to-1 or 1.5-to-1. That's all we can afford. Well, what are we going to do with South Carolina now? We've got 1.1 million people in the pool. It's projected to be 1.4 million people by the year 2014. So we're going to have all these people in the pool, and we're not going to have as much federal money coming down because we took those pieces of silver back in 2009. So, what are the other 2 cost drivers? Can we do something with those? Well, the second cost driver is what? The services that are rendered. Well, we're told by the federal government what we have to do, what we have to provide. And if we don't provide those services, then we don't get any Medicaid match. So you really can't do anything there. And then the third cost driver is provider reimbursement. Well, you can't simply keep squeezing doctors because if you keep lowering the amount of money they get, they're going to opt out of Medicaid entirely and not provide any care. And that means individuals are going to go to emergency rooms for care. And that means costs are going to exponentially rise. So we've got no controls over this predicament that we voluntarily got ourselves in. We have an exploding Medicaid pool. We're going to have less federal dollars coming down here. And so that's why I say we've got a window of opportunity to try to get our house in order. And let me talk to you about what I mean by that. And the first thing is to recognize this. In order to truly have South Carolina become the freest state in the nation. Because I think that is the key. If we can become the freest state in the nation that has a limited government, a state that has a limited government. We're not a nation yet, we might be. A state government that truly has checks and balances, a state government that truly respects individual liberty and respects the free market and understands that entrepreneurs are what drives growth and not the government. If we can become that state, and we're perceived by other members of the United States that that is who we are as a state, that I think when California and Illinois and New York and some of these other states start to fail, and I think they will fail, their structural problems are so severe they cannot fail unless the federal government bails them out. And if the federal government bails them out, then there's going to be another problem that we have on our hands, because I'll be right there with you going to Washington, D.C. if that happens. So what can we do to make South Carolina that state where people want to bring their families and bring their money and take their ideas and thrive and raise a business and prosper? Well, first of all, a little humility is in order. It's not going to come from Columbia. It's not going to come from the leadership that's up there right now. It's not going to come from the legislators up there right now. It's going to come from you guys. It's going to come from you guys taking your government back, making it truly a situation where these fellows and ladies up there are your public servants and not the other way around. We've gotten it way backward. And a great step in that regard has been taken by my friends at the South Carolina Policy Council. And they have got a very strong 8-point presentation. And I don't know if Ashley's been here to talk to this group in the past, Karen. Harry's going to do. Am I stealing your thunder? No, I'm sorry. Because I've been out there preaching this message, and I don't want to steal Harry's thunder, so I'll move quickly through it.
They kind of know, but you go.
Well, the first thing is to have a government. Oh my gosh, the time we need.
I'm going to give you additional time.
Okay. So the first thing is to have a legislative branch, an executive branch, and a judicial branch that performs their proper functions. We here in South Carolina live in what's called the legislative state. That's our state's nickname. And it's that way because the legislature is the seat of all power in South Carolina. Not only the power to make laws, like most legislatures have, but the power to control the judiciary. It elects the judges. It appropriates money to the judges. It has a judicial selection committee that decides who has the right to try to become a judge. I mean, they have a stranglehold over the judicial branch, the legislature does. It also has a stranglehold over the execution of our laws. The governor only executes a fraction of the laws that are passed in South Carolina. Not a true executive by any stretch of the imagination. Most of the laws are executed by either the Budget Control Board, upon which
and in 2014, we're going to elect a new U.S. Senator to replace Lindsey Graham. Are y'all going to help? We can do this. It's all about the movement. It's all about the people. Ron Paul has established a beachhead for liberty. It's up to us to go ahead and take that beachhead and move it forward. Thank you.